Ubisoft has never been slow to jump on a trend. If one of its own games proves popular, then sequels usually follow in short order, and successful design elements are often copied and pasted across different genre types. The open world collectathons of Assassin's Creed games became so widely used by Ubisoft and many other developers that you could probably classify Ubisoft open world as its own genre. Likewise, the system of clearing out camps in Far Cry games got transplanted into other Ubisoft games, including the Assassin's Creed series. Ubisoft isn't scared to borrow concepts from other publishers' games either, and is refreshingly open about it, such as admitting that side quests from The Witcher 3 were a huge inspiration for those in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. None of this is necessarily bad. Sure, it's largely done with a profit motive in mind, but on a more generous note, Ubisoft is simply giving people what they want. People liked those early Assassin's Creed games, so it made more until people started to get fed up, at which point it took a break and came back with something new. Perhaps the best justification for Ubisoft's imitation is the sincerest form of flattery approach, is that without it we probably wouldn't have Splinter Cell. The first Splinter Cell was an unabashed and open attempt to grab a piece of the stealth game market, which blew up after the release of Metal Gear Solid in 1999, and Ubisoft hoped it would provide a bit of competition to Metal Gear Solid 2. Yes, there were stealth games before Metal Gear Solid, such as Thief. However, multiple senior creatives such as writer Clint Hocking and executive producer Matthew Furland have both stated that Metal Gear Solid was the major inspiration, and the Ubisoft Montreal team was effectively told to make one of those. Even without this official confirmation, you could immediately tell what Splinter Cell was going for just by looking at the prominent tagline, "Stealth Action Redefined," that featured under Splinter Cell on the box art. This draws an obvious comparison to the tagline, "Tactical Espionage Action," which featured equally prominently on the art for Metal Gear Solid. I've never been entirely sure whether these taglines were intended to be part of the full name or not. Some publications would include them back in the day and some wouldn't. Either way, they aren't used anymore. Both games start off with cinematic intros before you even see a menu, which show the protagonists getting ready for a mission. However, whereas Metal Gear Solid's intro establishes the story as we watch Snake infiltrate an Alaskan base, Splinter Cell's intro quickly descends into what looks like a badly edited action movie trailer, with completely ill-fitting music over the top.
You know what you need to do.
And as another point of comparison, let's not forget Sam Fisher's infamous goggles, which were a deliberate attempt to make Sam Fisher instantly recognisable in the same way that Snake's headband made him recognisable. So yes, Ubisoft was trying to get some of those Metal Gear Solid dollars. There's no denying it. However, it's also worth remembering that we weren't exactly inundated with stealth games back in 2002, especially on console. With both Metal Gear Solid and the sequel, I would play them through again and again on the harder difficulties. Partly this was because I didn't have the money to buy new games, but it was also because there weren't any other games like these ones to buy. When Splinter Cell came out, I was still only 19 and very much the target audience for edgy and mature stealth games. Whereas Metal Gear Solid had more than its fair share of silly moments, such as Psycho Mantis reading your memory card and, well, just the whole hiding in cardboard boxes thing, Splinter Cell was all about the realism, from the environments to the story to the gadgets. However, Splinter Cell didn't start out this way. Before Ubisoft picked up the Tom Clancy license, the Montreal team was working on a game called The Drift, which was described in an IGN article as 70s retro future sci-fi. And no, I don't know what that means. I guess it's an alternative history kind of thing. Given that there would have been major cities floating on islands in the sky, perhaps Bioshock Infinite is the best point of comparison. The Drift had many elements that made it into Splinter Cell. In addition to it being in third person, although more of a shooter than a stealth game, it would have had a modular gun, different vision modes, and the option to shoot out cameras. One thing that didn't make it to Splinter Cell is the crowds of NPCs who would react to you in different ways, such as panicking if you were holding a gun out in the open. The Drift's big problem was a lack of focus. From reading between the lines a bit, it sounds like the developers came up with a cool world and some gameplay ideas, but didn't know how to put it all together. When it became clear the project was to be cancelled, there was a last-ditch attempt to convert it into a James Bond game, which was pitched to the license holder but to no avail. The Drift was officially put on hold, so Ubisoft Montreal took a stab at adapting it for the recently acquired Tom Clancy license. It went all out on the stealth elements and initially considered trying to make a game based on the novel The Sum of All Fears, which I remember really enjoying, although it was 20 years ago that I read it. I distinctly remember a gripping description of what happens in the nanoseconds it takes a nuclear device to explode, and found it fascinating. Anyway, Ubisoft Montreal eventually decided to make its own thing based on the Tom Clancy license, with the remit of making a Metal Gear Solid 2 killer. Ubisoft Montreal wanted Splinter Cell to be as realistic as possible, so instead of cities floating on islands in the sky, we have slightly more mundane locations like the CIA headquarters, foreign embassies, and oil rigs. Sam's gadgets were all modelled on what was possible at the time, such as optic cables to look under doors and basic lockpicking tools. Sam's suit was based on an actual Navy SEAL wetsuit designed to adapt to temperature changes. The story was also to be as realistic as possible while keeping things interesting. Perhaps grounded is a better word than realistic. Sam Fisher was to be an experienced operative, and initial designs had him with an entirely grey head of hair, which designers and focus groups felt gave the impression that he was too old, more retired than experienced. The Sam Fisher we ended up with still has those distinctive grey flecks at the side, but otherwise looks far more sprightly. Despite the focus on realism, Ubisoft Montreal opted to use animation instead of motion capture to model Sam's movements, which probably came as a huge relief to the guy who would otherwise have had to perform the split jump 100 times while in a mocap suit. Some movements were modelled based on recordings of developers acting them out, but it was still all animated. The end result was pretty spectacular. I remember being impressed with the PS2 version, which was released about 6 months after the Xbox and PC versions, alongside a GameCube port. However, it had notably worse graphics and performance than the Xbox version. While the PS2 version had 4 extra levels, it also had some sections cut out altogether, such as the cliff at the start of the final level, presumably due to the PS2's lack of power. Xbox and PC got 3 of those 4 extra levels soon after release. Across all these versions, Splinter Cell sold around 6 million copies as of 2005, and presumably a fair few more if you include the HD collection. I'm playing the PC version here with mods to support widescreen displays, plus a texture pack taken from the PS3 HD collection. I experienced a couple of graphical glitches and the rain doesn't look too good, but for the most part it's all perfectly presentable 17 years later. I have my suspicions that the HD textures caused a couple of niggles relating to Fisher interacting with the environment, such as when he wouldn't land on a ledge on the oil rig. There's no player interaction here, so it's not an input error. Fisher just won't stand correctly on the ledge for some reason. After enough tries, he decided to cling on. Lighting was Splinter Cell's standout feature, with visible rays of light peeking through blinds and spreading from car headlights. In a stealth game, and especially one as focused on hiding in the shadows as Splinter Cell, the light can be your worst enemy, and as a result it became a character in and of itself. Ubisoft had to nail this aspect, and it absolutely did. The tension felt when moving from the safety of the shadows to the danger of the light is palpable, as is the relief when you slowly move back into the darkness, identifiable only by the 3 green lights on your goggles. Screenshots of this looked positively tantalising back in the day, and I have to imagine the work put into the lighting more than paid off through extra sales. Another memorable visual effect of the time was what Ubisoft referred to as soft body objects, such as cloth and curtains. This was the first time I'd seen an effect like this, and it was fairly striking. On this playthrough I noticed the cloth had a tendency to randomly flail around, but that could be the mods at work. Realism isn't the be-all and end-all of video games. With every passing year I care less and less about graphical fidelity, and more about performance, story, and how fun the game is to play. That's easy to say now when graphical improvements are so incremental. When Splinter Cell was released, we were only just starting to see realistic models in games. Splinter Cell broke new ground, especially on console, where 3D games were usually mascot platformers. I wanted to pretend to be a James Bond or Ethan Hunt type spy, and as someone who didn't have an N64, my opportunities were limited. Splinter Cell was therefore nearly everything I was looking for. It feels a little weird to say that, because as I replayed it for this video, I realised I remember very little of it. Thinking back, I might have only played it once, so it certainly didn't live up to Metal Gear Solid 1 or 2 in that regard. I didn't put much thought into why that might be back in the day. 2003 was a time when I spent more hours playing Tiger Woods golf at 4 in the morning with my college roommates than I did playing all my other games put together. By the way, I'm not saying all 19-year-olds are dumb or incapable of deep analysis, but I bloody well was. It's obvious now why I would replay Metal Gear Solid but not Splinter Cell. Splinter Cell is incredibly linear and offers very little flexibility in how you approach each encounter. Once you've completed it, there isn't much need to go back and play it again. There were hardly any gameplay choices to make, and the story plays out exactly the same way regardless of what you do. To be fair, this was fairly standard for the time. Linearity has its advantages, and one of those is being able to handcraft the encounters. Fisher rarely has a choice of what route to take, which means Ubisoft can show off the leg split move by pretty much forcing players to use it in this exact spot. I didn't use it again throughout the entire game. It's not a useful move, but it sure does look good in screenshots. Beyond a few set pieces, linearity and a lack of options can significantly add to the tension. In fact, if Splinter Cell weren't so generous with ammo, it would have had a lot in common with survival horror games. For all I love the Metal Gear Solid and Hitman series, the amount of options at your disposal and the flexibility of approach available does reduce the tension somewhat. In both franchises, when you're caught, you can easily go hide in a locker or change your outfit and start again. However, in Splinter Cell you only get so many choices. Most encounters are handled in one of three ways, and there's a lot of overlap. First, you can try and sneak past unnoticed. I found this tough going both because it's difficult to keep an eye on where all the enemies are, but also because you often need to take out enemies to get key codes and the like. Second is the tried and trusted method of sneaking up on guards to take them out silently. Finally, you can take enemies out from afar once you have the sniper rifle. Whichever option you prioritise, you want to create as much darkness as possible by shooting out the lights. I typically went with option 2, but wouldn't hesitate to shoot everyone if it came to it. Taking enemies hostage and then shooting other enemies works smoothly and is incredibly satisfying. What you can't do is, well, everything else. You can't disguise yourself as one of the enemy, and there aren't many opportunities to set traps beyond bombs you stick to walls. If you get caught, you can't hide in a box. Guards are fairly aggressive when hunting you down, and even if you do manage to hide until the alert passes, you're still going to need to get past them somehow, except now you likely have fewer resources and you've already tried your best idea. Splinter Cell is fairly minimal. You don't have a lot of tools at your disposal and you'll use nearly everything you have. Most notably, for the time there was no handy little radar to show you enemy locations, and even their exact field of vision. It wasn't uncommon to navigate entire rooms in Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 just by looking at the radar. You might as well be playing an old Atari game at that point. And then of course there's the modern use of detective vision, or whatever you want to call it, which allows you to basically see through walls or pinpoint the exact shape and size of enemies from their footsteps. The closest Splinter Cell comes to detective vision is the heat vision mode on Sam's goggles, but even that is fairly limited and hard to use effectively. If you want to know what's on the other side of that door, you need to slide an optic cable underneath the gap at the bottom and wiggle it around a bit to see what you can through a monochrome fisheye lens. Lockpicking is much like sex. You just stick it in, wiggle it about a bit, and the quicker it's all over with, the better. There are some electronic keypads, but there's no magical gizmo that cracks the code in a few seconds. You'll need to either find the code via the tried and trusted method of reading emails conveniently left around on data sticks, or use your heat vision to look at the keypad shortly after it's been used and determine which buttons were pressed and in what order. I love using the distraction cameras that you can fire from the modular gun. They stick to any surface and can be used to either get a better view of your surroundings or to attract enemies with a noise and then knock them unconscious with gas once they're close. The attachments for the modular gun are more entertaining than the gun itself, which can quickly switch between a boringly easy sniper mode and a full-on assault rifle. It also has a bunch of non-deadly options, such as the sticky shockers and airfoil projectiles that knock people out instead of killing them. Conversely, the silenced pistol is too useless to rely on. I mainly used it for shooting out lights and moments of sheer panic where I got caught with nothing else on hand. There's some inaccuracy built in, so some of your shots will go astray, but even if you do line up the perfect headshot, don't expect to kill the enemy with one hit. One hit headshot kills seem to be restricted to shots fired from the sniper rifle mode on the SC-20K. Headshots with the silenced pistol or the SC-20K in normal mode don't kill, probably because that would make it all too easy. This is a little distracting given how much the rest of the game goes for realism. The directional mic is largely reduced to a pointless toy. You use it a couple of times in very specific locations and that's it. There's even one place where you have to use it to listen in on a conversation in the Chinese embassy, except the guy on the call gets nervous and wants to move the conversation elsewhere. He leaves the building and gets into his car. I thought I'd have to track the car around the corner, but the car just moves a few feet from the gate. You can listen in on the second conversation from the same place you can hear the first. The fixed nature of the environments was always a little disappointing. You can pick up bottles to use as a distraction and shoot computer monitors if you like, but it was a long way from watching ice cubes melt or moving around adult magazines to distract guards. Overall, the linearity combined with a camera that always sticks close to Fisher leads to a feeling of watching a story play out in front of you instead of being part of one. Splinter Cell forces you to be Fisher and do as he's ordered. Fisher doesn't have much choice in how he goes about his business, and neither do you. In fact, Fisher's relatively blank slate personality fits in well with your role as the player. Both Fisher and the player have to stick to the rules provided by Lambert at the beginning of the mission. For example, no one can see you, or you can't go to street level, or you can't kill anyone. As a player, we're used to following orders, not questioning them, and so is Fisher. He doesn't ask whether he should kill people, it's enough that he can. This all blends in well with the method of storytelling, which keeps Fisher, and therefore the player, relatively detached from events outside of your direct missions. The consequences of your actions aren't shown in flashy cutscenes, but through clips of news broadcasts, which aren't always entirely reliable, such as when the US government spreads misinformation about the nature of attacks on its own soil. You can also pick up pieces of plot through interrogating enemies and reading data logs, although the latter is often more flavour text than actual story.
Who do you work for?
Vyacheslav Grinko.
Tell me about him.
He used to be Spetsnaz. Now he's mercenary.
In many ways, Fisher is the perfect Ubisoft protagonist. World War III is threatening to kick off around him, but he rarely reflects on the deeper meaning or consequences attached to his actions. You can imagine Fisher saying things like "I don't do politics" right before he assassinates a foreign leader to preemptively block a nuclear attack on American soil. You and Fisher end up feeling detached from the outside world, determined to do your job while relatively immune from the consequences of failure, which are presented as things that happen to other people. Fisher is a weapon of the state, and you can only hope those wielding the weapon are doing the right thing. The story itself also goes for that grounded, albeit not always realistic vibe. I've always thought of the story as being like Mission Impossible, although with hindsight I think I might have been swayed by a bunch of previews in magazines that threw the comparison around a lot, likely at the behest of the publishers. There are some genuine points of comparison though, like how you play as a lone operative backed up over a radio by a remote squad, and together you are part of a top secret US organisation, tasked with doing a lot of overseas espionage. Plus there's this white room that looks a lot like the one from the first movie. Fisher is part of the Third Echelon, a top secret group used by the NSA when its more traditional methods of information gathering aren't sufficient. Fisher is the field agent who reports to Lambert and works alongside Vernon Wilkes, a field agent, and Grimsdaughter, a tech expert. This group together is a Splinter Cell, not in the sense that they are a splinter group from the NSA, but, according to the game's manual at least, because a splinter in a cell is small and nearly invisible. Splinter Cell's story isn't overly impressive. It boils down to a fairly by-the-numbers thriller where you track down bad guys, uncover a spy in your ranks, deal with rogue factions in other nations, and eventually prevent the outbreak of World War III. In many ways, Splinter Cell's story is more interesting now than it was 15 years ago. There's a point near the end when you capture a target and hand him over to your team. Shortly after, Lambert gives you mission-crucial information over your headset. It's only by reading the data logs that you are forced to confront how Lambert and Grimsdaughter got that information, namely through brutal torture. The information is tucked away in a place that can be easily ignored. Perhaps I never found this back in the day, or I was simply too naive to appreciate the reality of it, but reading this now is certainly a lot more uncomfortable. I'm not sure if this information was intended as any commentary on US military strategy and intelligence gathering, or whether it was just intended to be flavour text. But either way, it's in there and the player is ultimately going to be affected by it. A major part of the story revolves around Russian attempts to target the US with digital and information warfare, which is accomplished through hacking. Russians were still the de facto enemy in political fiction around this time, and the world was still getting to grips with everyone being connected and how that might play out in future conflicts. It's impossible not to view this in a different light in 2019, when Russian hackers are attacking Western democracies through information warfare. If Ubisoft does make a new Splinter Cell, it won't have to stray far from the themes of the original to stay relevant. Of course, stories about Russia and hacking might be a little too close to the bone. These days you aren't allowed to create art that is thematically relevant to any modern day issues, and politics in games was made illegal by the same people who bang on about the importance of freedom of expression and think game developers should be able to tell whatever story they want. I can just imagine the YouTube thumbnails if Ubisoft tried to insert politics into its Tom Clancy licensed political fiction game. Perhaps Splinter Cell got away with the overtly political themes because the story is about Americans killing foreigners, which I believe is excluded from the definition of politics in the Angry Gamer Bible. You can dig further into the ethics of what's going on if you like, which I did briefly a minute ago, but you certainly don't have to. It's like a Call of Duty game in that respect. At one stage there's mention of ethnic cleansing in Afghanistan, which brings NATO into play, and the US government covers up most of what happens on its own soil. However, these are mostly blink and you'll miss it moments. You assassinate the leader of a country with barely a mention. Despite being strongly pro-American exceptionalism, this approach is at least more interesting than shoving everyone on a fictional island to shoot randoms, or setting a story in Washington DC with barely any mention of the US government's role in the story. Most of Splinter Cell's story is fairly rote. Fisher is an experienced Navy SEAL. The events of the game are presented as Fisher's first mission for the third echelon, although a prequel novel appears to contradict that. Your mission is to track down 2 American agents who have gone missing in Georgia. They are already dead when Fisher finds them, killed by a Russian called Grinko because they had crucial information about a potential attack on the United States. By following the trail you end up uncovering a mole in the CIA and a plot to detonate a nuclear device in the US. At one point it looks like China might be involved as well, however it turns out to be a rogue faction and war is averted once we kill the only person who knows the code to activate the device. The 3 extra missions have you tracking down a tech expert from the main game and you end up on a sub stopping a nuke. There's a weak attempt to humanise Fisher somewhat by including his daughter, but she barely features. And it feels like a late addition when someone realised that perhaps Sam does need some personality or at least a reason to fight. Splinter Cell's story isn't especially thrilling, but the mission structure is solid, offering a decent amount of gameplay and visual variety. Missions are lengthy, typically an hour or even an hour and a half each, and you often move between exterior and interior environments multiple times within the same level. The very first mission, where you go looking for the missing agents, has you starting on the roof where you must find your way into a warehouse which you need to escape soon after when it's set on fire, before heading to a safe house and retrieving a black box from behind a painting, and then breaking into a police station via the holding cells and eventually making it to the morgue where you find the missing agents. One entire level is devoted to just reaching the entrance to the Chinese embassy in Myanmar. You don't go inside until a later level, at which point you have to find another way back to the embassy first. By the time you get inside, you really feel like you earned it. When a level does threaten to be a little dull, such as the CIA headquarters or the corporate building nearby, there's an attempt made to keep things fresh by adding in restrictions like not being able to kill anyone or dealing with a bunch of bombs. There's little in the way of exploration or player agency. If you ever get a choice of routes, one of them will quickly reveal itself to be a dead end, probably with a med pack nearby as a half-hearted reward for exploration. It's the developers taking pity on you for going out of your way, and so they give you something you'll likely never use anyway. Health isn't much of an issue in Splinter Cell. I always had enough health kits, and if you do get into a gunfight you'll probably die before you can use them. On 2 occasions I had to backtrack a bit to move on, but that was so incredibly rare I thought I was going the wrong way. You always just keep pushing forward, which means you rarely need to think about where to go. It's a shame because early on it looked like the data sticks were going to be used to provide useful information about where to go and what to do, but they soon abandoned that idea. I've tried to take as positive an approach as I can with regards to Splinter Cell's linearity, but it definitely feels limiting at times, and I was punished every time I tried to express a bit of creativity. For example, when you're trying to get close to the Chinese embassy, you're told that your one chance to get past the guard is to time it with a truck that turns up as a distraction. The truck pulls up and you listen in while the driver has a conversation with the guard. To me, the most obvious thing to do here is to climb into the back of the truck while the driver and guard are distracted, and then let the truck take me further into the embassy. There's even something to hide behind on the truck. But no. Despite it clearly being low enough, the truck isn't one of the designated things that Fisher will grab hold of. Instead, you just need to crawl around the corner, which is not as exciting. To be fair, the truck doesn't end up going far anyway, but you wouldn't know that the first time around. Very rarely you need to keep certain guards alive because they have a code you need, but in the heat of the moment you can easily panic and kill the wrong person. Your punishment is an abrupt mission over instead of being given a chance to find another way. The lack of freedom really hit home during one of those extra missions. I came across a vent you could open and climb inside, which may not sound all that exciting. However, every other time I'd found a vent before this point, it had been the only way to go. Vents were just another mandatory door you had to open. This vent wasn't on the path forward, it seemed to represent a rare choice. Maybe it would help me get the jump on some enemies up ahead. No such luck. You climb up to a slightly higher level and fall through a gap in the ceiling just a few yards from the vent entrance. All it had done was take me backwards. I was slightly confused until I came back this way later, which is one of the only times you ever double back on yourself, and found that this vent was now necessary to get the jump on a kernel you need to take captive. Spotting vents you can crawl through and pipes you can climb is completely devoid of satisfaction when you realise it's a vent you have to crawl through or a pipe you have to climb. Splinter Cell was tougher than I remembered. I thought my memory might be playing tricks on me, but it turned out that Ubisoft did in fact reduce the difficulty for the PS2 and GameCube versions that I played. The main difference was a crucial change to enemy AI that made them less sensitive to noise, including gunshots. Being able to kill an enemy without being heard makes a huge difference to the challenge. The tougher enemy AI in the PC version makes Splinter Cell a lot more of a trial and error experience than I remember. Guards spot and kill you in seconds and your own shots can easily go astray. As mentioned, there are no enemy vision cones or even a radar showing enemy placements, although Fisher's Heat and night vision goggles can help with that. There are also a bunch of variables affecting the noise you make, so not only do you have to think about whether you're crouching or standing, you have to consider the speed at which you're doing both and the surface you're walking on. The system of sneaking up behind enemies is far more challenging than it is in modern games. You have to get incredibly close. Guards don't stay stationary for long, and Fisher's slowest speed, while quiet, is also slower than the enemy movement. You end up needing to scurry along to catch up with enemies and then slow down just before they hear you and hope you can get close enough for the grab before they turn around. This usually fits into the category of challenging but fair, however it can also be inconsistent. Being in the dark shadows is sometimes enough for guards to walk past you entirely, but at other times they will start shooting right away. Other than a bit of inconsistency, the challenge is largely enjoyable. However, I found myself incredibly thankful for the quick save on the PC version, because the infrequent checkpoints would have driven me crazy with each death. Once you've found a way past an encounter, you can almost certainly replicate the experience, so having to start from a checkpoint 15 minutes ago is unnecessary and tedious. The stealth action is slow and it isn't particularly fun to sit there and wait for a bunch of scripted guard movements to play out. I hesitate to call anything outright unfair because I know that's basically a red rag to a certain type of gamer out there, but some of this stuff was outright unfair. It took me about 5 attempts to drop off this pipe and punch the guard here just enough to daze him but not knock him out, and then use him on the retinal scanner. He always hears you when you drop down and turns around before you can grab him. I was so thankful for the quick save here. Most of my deaths had nothing to do with getting caught by enemies. The biggest killer was the environment, and by the end of my playthrough I surprisingly found myself missing some of the hand-holding found in many modern games. Hand-holding is often used as a derogatory term when talking about games, but it shouldn't be. It's all in the context. Hand-holding should be available to the extent necessary for different types of players. It's only a problem when it becomes overly intrusive and can't be turned off. In Splinter Cell, would have liked a few more visual clues around the environment. A common trick in action-adventure games is to use a certain colour to mark up ledges that can be climbed to ease navigation. It avoids those moments where you keep trying to make a jump, unsure if your timing is just a bit off or if you aren't supposed to be able to grab the ledge anyway. A more subtle version of this involves the use of light to guide the way, with important objects or the intended route standing out in the darkness. This technique may seem cheap, but if you think that, just go and play the old Tomb Raider games, where you'll spend ages uncertain of which jumps you're supposed to be able to make if you get the timing just right, and which ones are actually impossible. Ironically, the latest Tomb Raider game, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, has gone full circle by giving the player the choice to turn off all the hints and figure out what you can and can't jump on yourself. It works in modern Tomb Raider because of how detailed the environments are and other more subtle techniques such as lighting and perspective. Splinter Cell is incredibly inconsistent in the way it uses visual clues, which can be unnecessarily distracting. Ubisoft's desire to have everything appear as natural and realistic as possible means objects that can be interacted with often blend into the environment. The training mission shows you how to climb pipes, which would be simple enough if you could always climb pipes, but you can't. Many of them look identical, especially in low light, and they seem to offer tempting new paths through the levels. Except you can't climb them, or worse, it looks like you can't climb them, but you actually can if you keep trying, which means every time you see a pipe you want to climb, you have to try about 10 times before you can be sure. For example, I kept trying to get Fisher onto this pipe here, but he wouldn't grab hold of it. I was about to give up and assume Fisher just wasn't meant to climb that pipe when, for some reason, he actually did grab it. Likewise for ledges that Fisher can grab hold of. He's incredibly finicky when deciding what he will hold on to and when. For example, on the last level you have to walk off the cliff so that Fisher automatically grabs the edge, which you then use to shimmy past a narrow gap. However, Fisher won't grab the edge if you walk off unless your movement speed is set to slow. Even if you gradually back off the edge, he won't grab it. In other places your movement speed isn't relevant to whether or not Fisher will grab hold of an edge. That's why running jumps are a thing. For some reason though, you must set Fisher to slow mode before he will grab this edge. He'll even grab the edge on the other side when in normal speed, except for some reason you can't shimmy around the corner here. Yes, it can be a bit silly that Uncharted hardly ever lets you fall to your death, but I'll take all those awkwardly animated last second grabs over falling off this ledge again and again. Splinter Cell can't quite decide what it wants to do with interactable items and largely settles for an approach of making it clear the first time and then not bothering again after that. This is okay in principle, after all we don't want tutorial prompts popping up constantly throughout the game, but it does lead to some odd moments. Take the first rappel point you come across, which is brightly lit to draw the eye towards it. The next time you come across one it's camouflaged in the darkness, and I only noticed it because of the text pop up telling me I could interact with it. These rappel points are incredibly rare, so it's not something you constantly need to keep an eye out for. To be fair, I can understand why Splinter Cell restrains itself when it comes to using lights to highlight items. Light is a crucial part of the stealth system. You can't just throw spotlights around willy-nilly to highlight every object you can interact with to guide the player forward. Still, there has to be a happy medium. Couldn't the interactable items at least be a different colour from the background to help them stand out a bit? Of course, with the quick save feature you don't need to worry too much about those moments of confusion. If you aren't sure about a jump you can just save beforehand. Nowadays without a quick save feature I'd find this insufferable. I'd be more reluctant to make ambitious jumps knowing I had to start the entire level again if I failed. Getting lost and not knowing the way forward can be fun and part of the challenge, but it has to feel fair, which in this case requires consistency of design. Failing a jump because you messed it up is one thing. Failing because Sam's fingers decide not to grab hold of a ledge is quite another. Without clear rules, the simplest things can become frustrating. There's no way of knowing which windows can be slid open without getting close and looking for the interaction text pop up. This window looked distinctly unusable because it had furniture in the way, but you can actually open it. There's a mission where you need to break into the CIA headquarters. There are two ways to do this, which is incredibly unusual for this game. The first option is to break in through the vents while they are deactivated. This is presented as the preferred choice, but it's timed, so you have to be quick. Finding the vents is easy, although getting Fisher to actually grab hold of these ledges is overly finicky. I nearly gave up and thought there must be another way. There's nothing to indicate that you can interact with the vents or where to do so. I think both vents are usable, but I couldn't find anything on the vent on the right, so I tried the one on the left. Remember, there's a strict time limit here. I went over to the other vent, which required multiple reloads because time kept running out as I tried to make the jump, and eventually I found the one specific corner that brought up the interact prompt. No one wants to die due to not being able to find the correct interaction point on a vent. A final example of how bad Splinter Cell can be at communicating information to the player is with the explosive wall mines. You can disarm these things by slowly walking up and interacting with them. However, it's not at all clear that you have to press the interact button just as the flickering light changes from red to green. Before you say that's obvious, I should point out that it takes Sam a few seconds to deactivate each mine, so it's not like he suddenly cuts a wire at the exact time you press the button. He only starts messing with the device when you say so. Another way Splinter Cell falls a little short when compared to that other stealth franchise is its audio, both in terms of voice acting and music. The main actors all do a good job. Now obviously Michael Ironside as Fisher is absolutely fantastic. The behind the scenes documentary includes an interview with Sam Fisher as he talks about his consulting role on the game, and this made me realise that I could probably listen to Michael Ironside saying absolutely anything.
My role in the development of Splinter Cell. Well, first Ubisoft brought me in as a technical advisor. For the sake of realism, they wanted input from someone who actually... well, somebody who actually does this kind of work.
Unfortunately, there isn't much voice acting beyond the main cast of Third Echelon members. We barely interact with the antagonist Nicolades, with the notable exception of this excellent scene when he's betrayed and you're left to fend for yourself until Grimm's daughter initiates a blackout. The random enemy dialogue is atrocious. I remember once in the Chinese embassy I heard a random ni hao with a really bad Chinese accent. I happened to die and start again, and this time the guard said hello in a really bad English accent this time. I'm not sure what's going on there.
I have to see the convoy before it leaves.
I understand, but this is the only time.
Yeah, how? Hello?
The music tries to capture a James Bond vibe, but all they could get was a budget knockoff. The music ramps up a bit when guards are searching for you and gets to full speed when you're actively in battle, but it never feels natural, always cutting in and changing incredibly abruptly. The music was more likely to make me jump than the guards. To be fair, the music does vary between levels, which keeps it interesting, incorporating local instruments such as Georgian guitars and Burmese drums. In terms of minor nitpicks, the turrets feel completely out of place and can be easily turned off anyway. In theory, you can use them against other guards, but I only found one occasion to meaningfully use them this way. The infamous split jump is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, but I hardly ever used it. There are a few graphical glitches, but for all I know they've been introduced by the mods, just something to be aware of. Finally, I don't like the way the alarm level ramps up if you don't hide all the bodies. The bodies aren't actually being discovered by guards as far as I can tell. Instead, when you reach certain points in the level, the game checks to see if any bodies have not been hidden, and the alarm stage is upgraded. If too many bodies get discovered, then Lambert calls the mission off, which would be incredibly frustrating if it weren't for those quick saves. With the limited flexibility both in terms of mission approach and interaction with the environment, it's impossible to forget you're playing a game from the early 2000s, regardless of what mods you use. In terms of present day games, Splinter Cell is more comparable to perhaps a triple-I game like Hellblade or A Plague Tale, games that look lovely but keep you on specific paths and limit your options. That's not meant as a stinging criticism. I enjoyed Hellblade, and Splinter Cell offers a thoroughly entertaining 12 to 15 hours of stealth action redefined. I recommend you check it out while you wait for a full sequel. I plan to do a video on each of the 6 major Splinter Cell releases, roughly one a month, so please subscribe if you want to see them. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you could hit like and share the video in the right places, and let me know what you thought in the comments. If you want to go above and beyond, then you can sign up to my Patreon for $1 a month, which gets your name in the credits and a Patreon role in my Discord server. My next video is still a surprise, but it's a big one. It should be out at the end of June, but I can't promise that it won't slip into early July. There's a good reason why, which I think will become evident when you see it. Okay, thank you for watching. Until next time, cheers.